Jesus is definitely raised. There's a resurrection narrative. What there's not are appearances of Jesus to the disciples.
Welcome back to Deflate, where you learn to tackle the skeptics' objections to Christianity. My name is Lucas, and today we're responding to famous New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, who claims that the appearances of the risen Christ are invented stories that undermine the historicity of Jesus' resurrection.
A lot of people on the kind of more skeptical side of reading things say that Mark doesn't have a resurrection narrative. It's not true. Mark does have a resurrection narrative. The women go to the tomb after Jesus has been buried. They go on the third day, and the tomb's empty. A young man there tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. Verse 8 of chapter 16 says, "And the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid." Boom, and and so Jesus is definitely raised. There's a resurrection narrative. What there's not are appearances of Jesus to the disciples afterwards. In Matthew, they go off and tell the disciples, and the disciples go up to Galilee. They meet Jesus there. It's just the opposite.
So Ehrman's point is the following. In Mark, we may well find the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. However, the story abruptly ends with the women not telling anyone about the risen Christ because they're afraid. Nor is there any mention of Jesus appearing to anyone. Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels. Thus, the accounts we find in the later three Gospels, where the women tell others about the risen Christ and where the risen Jesus appears to them, don't represent what actually happened. Instead, they are theologically motivated embellishments of the story smuggled in by Matthew, Luke, and John in order to bolster the made-up narrative of a risen Christ. However, Ehrman's argument isn't as clear-cut as it seems to be once you check out the context of the passage in Mark. The angel says to the women at the tomb, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So the angel commands the women to go and tell the disciples that the risen Christ will meet them in Galilee. Then the women go off, and Mark tells us that they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It is far from clear that this means that they said nothing to anyone at all, as Ehrman and other skeptics want you to believe. What is at least as plausible of an option is that they said nothing to anyone on their way to tell the disciples that they, the disciples, are about to meet the risen Christ in Galilee. Note that the Greek expression for being afraid used here is used in a number of other places in Mark, where it denotes a kind of fear that is the result of encountering the supernatural. These women just had an angel speak to them at the tomb, and so their fear has nothing to do with them somehow shying away from talking to people about the resurrection. Instead, it's a reaction to them just having met an angel who told them to go to the 12 and tell them about the risen Christ. And so off they go to share the news with the disciples. Another relevant parallel is Mark 1:44, where Jesus tells a leper he just healed to see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to them. Clearly, the implication is that the leper will actually talk to the priests at the temple about what happened in order for them to perform the necessary sacrifice. And so, what Jesus tells this leper is to go to the temple and to tell the priests his story, but to not talk to anyone on his way there. As far as the appearances are concerned, does their absence in Mark's narrative mean that he thought they didn't actually happen? Hardly so. In Mark 14:28, Jesus is recording as saying to his disciples, "After I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." So clearly, Mark wants his readers to expect that Jesus will appear to the disciples in Galilee after his resurrection. In contrast, if Mark thought that the risen Christ did not actually appear to his disciples, there would have been no reason for him to include Jesus' own prediction of his appearance. Note that in Mark 14:28, Jesus doesn't just talk about him being raised back to life. No, he explicitly adds that he will meet the disciples in Galilee, which is the very thing the angels reiterate to the women. So one could say that Mark may have left the ending open on purpose, expecting his readers to fill in the gap themselves. Interestingly enough, this can be said of pieces of important ancient literature, such as Homer's Iliad, where the fall of Troy is merely alluded to, but not actually recounted. Yet, everyone at the time knew that Troy actually fell. And so it was a matter of literary craftsmanship on Homer's part to not recount the actual fall of the city, while legitimately expecting from his readers to fill in the gaps themselves. Thus, the fact that Mark didn't narrate the actual appearance of the risen Christ to the disciples is no argument for the idea that Mark didn't actually think of the appearances as a historical fact. He may have left this gap open intentionally, expecting his readers to fill it in not only based on Mark's gospel as a whole, but also because they would have known about appearances from either their own first-hand experience, the testimony of others, or from reading another gospel, or even Paul. So Bart Ehrman really doesn't have that compelling of a case here. And if you want to know why Alex O'Connor doesn't have that strong of an argument when offering his supposedly biggest case against Christianity, please check out this video over here. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.